have Berthe Jansen. No. So we are so excited to have Berthe Jansen for our summer program public lecture series. Berthe is an assistant professor of Tibetan studies at Leiden University. She is also an recipient of European Research Council ERC starting grant for a project on the Tibetan and Himalayan materials in the Van Manen collection. And her talk today is also very closely connected to her project. We are so looking forward to the lecture. Please welcome Berthe Jansen.
So thank you for coming. So maybe today is a little bit unusual in the sense that I'm going to talk about something that I have. Usually you talk about the stuff you have researched, and I'm talking about the things that I want to be working on, and I'm going to be working on for the coming 5 years. So this, the topic of today is about the Van Manen collection and about what I want to do, planning to do in my project that is starting the 1st of August. So that's next week, more or less. It is a five-year project where I will work with a team of other researchers, postdocs, and a PhD, and we'll work together. And what I want to show you is sort of how I envision this to work, and give you a little bit of a preview of the ideas that I have by sort of looking at this collection on a, well, not quite superficial level, but I expect to sort of find out a lot more. So I expect that many of you, unless you've been talking to me, have not heard of the Van Manen collection before. This is, the cursor is meant to just work. So this is Johan Van Manen. He was a Dutch, initially a theosophist, a self-made scholar, the secretary to the Asiatic Society, and an avid collector of Himalayan materials. And that was his sort of great passion. So he moved to India in 1909. He started off at the Theosophist Society in Adyar as a librarian, but he sort of broke with a Theosophical Society and moved to Kalimpong in order to study Tibetan. And there he started learning Tibetan and also collecting his works. And what we have, so after his death, they were sent, he didn't have children, so they were sent to Leiden University, and it consisted of both texts and artifacts. Initially, they were, of course, collected together, sent to the university together, and at that time, the Ethnographic Museum in Leiden was part of the university. So, but at some point in the 1970s or 80s, the Ethnographic Museum sort of went its own way, and they came to own all the artifacts, and the university library had all the texts, or at least that is the idea. And it contains, if we're just looking at the text right now, it contains autobiographies of non-elite Himalayan people. I will talk about that later on. And it also consists of potentially rare and unique Tibetan texts, and also a lot of written materials that are either poorly archived or unarchived. And then there's the sort of material culture side in the Ethnographic Museum, where we have art, so tankas, but also ritual objects and other objects of use that may or may not be intended for kind of religious practice. So what the Van Manen collection is also famous for, which I'm using scare quotes because I mean it's at the moment not really famous for anything, but the very few people who study Lepcha language will know that it houses the largest Lepcha manuscript collection in the world. And then seeing that that's only 182 manuscripts, that's sort of shows how relatively rare this language is. My project is not, unfortunately, not going to deal with these manuscripts. They have been catalogued, but because I don't read Lepcha, I have left them to the side. But that would be a really great sort of add-on at some point to look at the cultural significance of these manuscripts. So there's almost 1,000 block prints, 576 Tibetan language manuscripts, and then 425 catalogued artifacts. But there's also sort of knowing that these museums are a little bit messy. There's just boxes of stuff there, which are in storage. Nobody has looked at them for, 50, 60 years. And what is catalogued is kind of poorly catalogued as well. So with the knowledge of scholars of Buddhist art in the 1950s. So things have progressed since then. So Van Manen himself started collecting, and this is kind of a long quote, but this is in a sort of, he was, of course, alive. So the main texts and artifacts he seemed to have collected in the 1920s. So that's sort of the largest activity. And at that time, people who were interested in Buddhism, and especially those in Europe, were interested in canonical Buddhism. So they were collecting the Kangyur, the Tengyur. They were trying to see how the Tibetan works connected with sort of original Indian Buddhism. But Van Manen had a different view, or had different interests. And I underlined that he was particularly interested in the study of Tibetan gods. And then he also says, the topic has hitherto been little illustrated from its material aspect or from that of ritual, so closely akin to ethnography. So here the important keywords are material aspects, rituals, and ethnography. So maybe this work is known to all of you. Nebeski Vojković, in a way, followed in the footsteps of Van Manen in terms of his interests. I mean, this whole work is about Tibetan gods. And it is also not entirely a coincidence that Nebeski Vojković was the first to actually make some sort of a catalogue of the Van Manen collection. Vojković worked in Leiden for, and he was paid, it was sort of a paid job so that he could travel to Sikkim and to India. He worked to catalogue the Van Manen collection, and of course he also used and was inspired by the kinds of texts that were in the Van Manen collection. There is a parallel project going on in Vienna, led by Uwe Hartmann. The other, Uwe Niebuhr, who where he's cataloging Nebeski Vojković's artifacts, like artworks and texts. And there's a remarkable a sort of level of similarity between the collections, of course, also because they were working in the same region. So yeah, similar interests. So what I want to achieve with this project is the following. So looking at how someone collected, collection formation, how a collection came together, but also looking at where he collected these texts from. And then sort of comes the question, can we get an idea of, by looking at, first of all, a collection, and then what is sort of the letters and the papers and the notes and the correspondences that exist around this collection, can that give us information about how he got these texts, where he got them from? And if so, can that tell us something about the cultural and religious environment of the region that he collected in? So that would be, the dissemination and production of Himalayan literature, and of course also not just literature, but also the objects in the early 20th century. And then the idea is then also, we have kind of two collections, at least two. We have these artifacts, we have these texts, they belong together. That's my sort of inkling, that he did not just haphazardly collected text and then haphazardly collected ritual objects, but that that he was interested in, let's say, the whole package. As he said in this quote, the material aspects, the rituals, sort of the level of ethnography, or sort of the interest in ethnography. So then the question is, can we make this initial way he collected it, can we make this visible for a public? And I will show you how I think that will work out later on. So these are kind of the key questions. How do we read? And sort of that's the idea, is that, of course, this is one collection, but while I sort of say, well, this collection has unique aspects, the fact that someone at some point in time collected both objects and texts is not unique. There are many more collections like that. And so that one of the questions is, well, one of the things that I hope to achieve is to also sort of present a methodology in which people who want to work on similar connections then know how to work on it, know how to present these multimedia collections. So looking at cultural production and the extent to which this tells us something about the social-religious landscape of the Eastern Himalayas in the early 20th century. And there's a map here, but of course, I assume you all to be quite familiar with the region. So he and his informants were living around the Greater Kalimpong area, which was, of course, prior to sort of the British involvement, part of the Kingdom of Sikkim. And of course, a cultural melting pot where you had all these different Himalayan ethnic groups coming together, Tibetans, Nepalese, Sikkimese, and what have you. So what I want to do is sort of look at the different aspects of this collection and then show how these come together, or how I sort of hope they will come together at some point. Also, if there's like questions in between, please feel free to just raise your hand. I mean, there's time at the end, but yeah, if there's anything that sort of really doesn't make sense to you, please do let me know. the drawing at the bottom, if you maybe you can't see very well, but is a drawing by one of his assistants, which I will also talk about later on. And this is Van Manen in Calcutta. After he lived in Kalimpong, he moved to Calcutta, where he also passed away. And these are his other two assistants depicted working, copying Tibetan texts. So the artifacts, there's very few actually on display in the Ethnographic Museum in Leiden. What they have on display is kind of sort of, I would say, maybe a standard display of beautiful Buddhist things that tell you something about Buddhism. When you look at the actual collection, you see what might be labeled as, of course, especially by museum curators, as low quality items. So you see that there's actually, he had a whole range of tankas, which were very clearly painted, perhaps commissioned by him, but they were similar to the tankas people around here would have in their homes. Not elaborate, not like super refined, but representing a deity and filling a need in that way. So there's many different tankas, different deities, and also objects of use. So the question is, how are they connected? And of course, this is a very kind of a hot topic right now. You may sort of read about this in the papers, that we're talking about the repatriation of all these objects that were collected in a colonial context. And here we have kind of an interesting case in that Van Manen was, I call him a para-colonial, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess it's sort of a real word, but someone, of course, he was moving within the British Raj. He worked for the Asiatic Society, but he was not part of the system. And for now, it seems that the way he collected was, relatively respectful. But watch this space. There might be more that will come out of it. And also, what is interesting about Van Manen is that he was not particularly rich, which means that he also couldn't afford all the sort of antiques and the really sort of top pieces that were around. He could afford the things that local people could afford, and then of course he had much more than local people would have. So there is that sort of one way of looking at it, is sort of how does a person, how does this kind of collection that is not entirely colonial, but it's also not free of colonialism, how do we deal with the objects that we have in there? Do we need to do anything? So here are some of the top pieces on display. These are the older ones, so most of them are from basically the early 20th century or late 19th century. And this is the way they are displayed. I will get back to those artifacts here later on. You just keep in mind there's a drum and a gangling, thigh bone, trumpet, which is, by the way, just as a side note, this is another thing that's happening in museums, and I'm kind of curious also to learn what you think, is that all museums are removing anything that's made of human remains, which then means they're getting rid of this, and they're also getting rid of this. They're getting rid of a lot of things, especially when it comes to Tibetan, the Tibetan things that they usually display, the skull cups, the thigh bone trumpets, etc. The question also has been raised to me is like, how do Tibetans themselves view this? Because of course it's a whole different, I would say, from the Tibetan context, Tibetan Buddhist context, it's a whole different conversation, very different from, you know, the shrunken skulls from, you know, Papua New Guinea. It's a different story, I would say. But okay, let's leave, that's just an aside. This is another thing that Van Manen collected, some very beautiful painted pieces of paper. So this is a prognostication or astrological manual. And this is sort of to show, this is a more elaborate tanka, but this is also to show kind of the poor quality that many of these, or the poor state that many of these artifacts are in at the moment. This work I cannot, because the quality of the photos that the museum has is so very poor. I cannot show you any, you know, any better images, but this is a very interesting pilgrimage map to Mount Kailash, where it shows what temples to visit and what they're called. Really fascinating stuff. And these are just kept in boxes, either in the depot or in the basement of the museum. So moving on to the manuscripts, some questions that I have. I'm mainly interested in the manuscripts and not the block prints. Of course, the block prints, it's often easier to tell where they were from. And they're, let's say, you know, there's more of them. These are not unique works. But, you know, we'll look at block prints to some extent. So the questions are, where were they collected, how, and which texts are either rare or unique. And when we look at take a closer look at the catalog, then we see that there's many ritual texts, and some of them have, they have illustrations. Some are a little bit crude, some are quite beautiful and quite detailed. And we see also that there's lots of works that have to do with prognostication. So that gives kind of an idea of, or hints to me that, of course, this displays his interest in lived religion, what was important for people in that region at that time. But also gives an idea of what was around, what was available in the Kalimpong region, and could give some clues also where he collected these from. And of course, there's lecture texts as well. Just to give a bit of an idea of what these lecture texts look like, they're used sort of in lined school notebooks. They're obviously copies from something else, and they're occasionally either the scribe or the children of the scribe, they had just doodled in these pages as well. So you get, and there's, you know, there's Roman letters here, there's Tibetan, and there's some Nagari as well. So there's a kind of, gives you an idea of sort of the informality of these kinds of works, that Van Manen really was interested in copying them, but not necessarily having beautiful manuscripts or having the original. He was interested in the context or the contents of these works. So this is in color in the original, but you can access these texts digitally. So these are some of the, so this is in a manual on how to make tormas. So it gives you, you know, what they look like and what color they should have, etc. And what I just, as I mentioned, many of these texts actually are digitized, but I can see people turning their heads. They are digitized in a way that is not very user friendly. So, and I hope to change that, because actually you can all just access these texts right now. They are through IIIS. They are accessible through BDRC. But how this is a text that is bound, so which is sort of makes it excusable. But what they did when they photographed these texts was just take the beja leaves and just put them on 3 leaves on one side, photograph, and then turn them around, photograph. So that means you have to read like like that. So I also hope to at least make these sort of, it's a cut and paste job, I guess, to make them more readable, because as it stands, it's kind of awful. And this is another sample of, so the image quality is really not good here. On my screen, it's much better. Yeah, it's okay. So this is a ritual, so a sinengi choga, so a ritual which is about the suppression of si by some prominent scholars, also translated as vampire suppressing ritual. And it has been authored, according to the title, by Gongse Chugi Gyobo, or Chugi. And many people will say that this is Gongse Confucius. So this is actually a Pun text, but it seems quite rare. So there's actually there's Buddhist text in there. There's explicit sort of Pun text in there, but there's a lot of texts that have no label, which also sort of shows the sort of fluid nature of religious practice in that region. And I think that's still the case, also in many regions here as well. So then moving to maybe the sort of the in a way the most interesting, the most unknown part of this collection is that there's a number of boxes, about 8 boxes, just filled with papers. And they're just like any kind of paper. So they consist of notes, letters, receipts, boat tickets, unfinished manuscripts, unfinished books, and that is going to be a real challenge to deal with that. There are definite clues. This is not an example, but there are clues in these boxes as to how he collected. There is correspondence, but there's also receipts. So here is a receipt. So he wasn't able to go to Tibet himself, but he sent his assistants to Tibet, and then asked them to buy things. So, for example, kamche, kam dress. So the spelling you shouldn't worry too much about. Dorche, the dress of the nomad. To, ne, barley, grains, very clearly things that are used in some sort of a ritual. And here is a receipt of books that he bought. And these are sort of there, tucked into other things, and they're of course not catalogued. Another nice challenge is sort of Van Manen's own research. He was not, he did a lot of scholarly work, but he is not known as this great scholar. And this is actually also very largely because he was a facilitator of other scholars. So you see him thanked in many other works where he edited, he helped providing manuscripts. So he facilitated knowledge, but did not produce much himself. One of the things it seems he was working on, and you see that in the picture there, is he was actually working on a book on Yeti stories. So what he did was he had his assistants collect, just had anyone he would meet, really, it seems, collect stories on the Yeti. So, you know, you meet someone like, oh, where are you from? What do you know about the Yeti? Go ahead. And these are all written down in colloquial Tibetan. And there are draft translations of these stories. You see that he was already working on trying to organize it. He had someone, so these are bad photocopies. I have not located the original drawings yet, but he had someone illustrate the stories. And this is the sort of beginning of an introduction. He was also collecting secondary scholarship or information on the Yeti. And of course, we have to see this in the context. He was doing this in 1922. And this was actually, there was kind of a Yeti craze going on in Europe, and I think in the United States as well, that there were mountaineers going to Nepal and other places, and they heard about these stories and they started to think, oh, what's going on there? I think Van Manen to some extent was trying to kind of ride that wave of the Yeti popularity. And actually, I recently saw that it's coming back into fashion, that some scholars have actually, or sort of, people have said, well, there might actually really, this Yeti might actually really exist. And there's no reason necessarily to doubt it. And because we discover unknown species all the time anyway. So there might, I might help Van Manen publish this posthumously. Another very interesting aspect of this collection are the autobiographies that Van Manen asked his assistants to write. So he had 3 main assistants, and then a number of people who were sort of helping him with different things. And he, at some point, told them, please write down your life story. And these assistants, even though they read Tibetan well, one of them was trained even as a secretary at, the Ganden Potang. So he had very good handwriting, but they were not trained in literary Tibetan. They were not trained in composing. Instead, they wrote in colloquial Tibetan, in the way they spoke. And we actually not sure how he asked them to write it. I don't know. We don't know if he paid for these stories. And there are three well-known ones and 3 lesser-known autobiographies. And what is interesting is also that these assistants all had different ethnicities. So there was one who was born in Darjeeling with Khampa parents, but born in India. One that was from Sikkim, one from Lhasa, one who was half Chinese and half Tibetan, and one person from Ladakh. So there's different sort of perspectives. And another, what is very clear is that he intended for these autobiographies also to get published in some form. So they were in Tibetan, but he was his one assistant who from Darjeeling, who had relatively good English, he sort of produced as almost simultaneous to English translation / summary of these works. He also, while in Calcutta, he had a servant, what you used to call houseboy, who was actually of Chinese ethnicity, and he was also asked to write his life story. And this one actually, they did manage to get published posthumously after Van Manen's death, and is it's kind of, it's not a very rare book. Many university libraries have this, where he talks about his sort of travels and how he got to Calcutta, and descriptions of his life as a houseboy in Van Manen's household. And what was published in 1999 was kind of these taken, the summaries or simultaneous translations in Tibetan of 3 of these autobiographies were published in a book in a kind of an edited format. This book itself is already very interesting if you are interested in sort of more the social history of the region. But they have been really abbreviated, and the Tibetan originals are, I would say, about 3 times as long. They contain all these names and details, and sort of like, the one person would describe going from one place to the other, would describe how long it would take, how much they would have to pay, the muleteer, all these sort of details that are interesting for many scholars are left out in these works. So one of the aims in this project is also to get these autobiographies, to really study them on the basis of the Tibetan, and because Tibetan readers themselves often don't know of the existence of these works, one of the plans is also to make these works available to a Tibetan reading audience in a sort of understandable way, which is a challenge because the Tibetan is such that it's sort of mixed. It's very colloquial, sort of, I guess, to some extent, it still reads as someone just speaking, shijake, like the language you would speak in the settlements. But then, so there's mixed in with that, there's Hindi, there's English, there's some Nepali. So that is, for some Tibetan readers, it's challenging. So you have to sort of edit them. So that's one of the things that I also want to do in this project. And then they are also illustrated. So the Tinchen, who is the half Chinese person, actually, his autobiography is in 3 languages. It's in Tibetan, in Chinese, and in English. And he also illustrated his story with what he saw and what he describes. And here you see Nechung oracle, and some of these illustrations are really extraordinary not because of their artistic value, but because of the eye for detail, and also what they portray. So here it portrays the author of the Namtar in Van Manen's drawing room or study, where you see that he had a full Tibetan altar with here the Chinese bodhisattva, but he had a full Tibetan altar, which actually was also at some point a centerpiece at the museum, Ethnographic Museum, but it kind of disappeared somewhere. But it was kind of extraordinary for a Westerner to have an altar like this. And you can see Tangas at the top. And they also, his assistants also describe how many books he had and also how many languages he could read. This is another kind of vivid picture of the British invasion into Tibet, which he describes. And you can see, you know, that, you know, of course, that also the soldiers were not necessarily all British, they were mostly Indian, and sort of how the Tibetans fled. This one is I really love. It also has descriptions in English actually at the back of what it is, so there can be no confusion. So maybe those who sort of have studied some Tibetan history know about the Sogdok rituals, where the Mongol averting rituals, where some Nyingma monasteries were engaged with trying to avert the Mongols from entering Tibet during the sort of start of the Gandham Potang government. This is an Indok ritual, a British averting ritual, where you can see that there is a scapegoat figure, Elu, in the form of a British army officer, and it sort of describes the whole everything that was going on around the ritual, and it is also described in his autobiography. So I've never seen any reference to this before. So it is kind of extraordinary. So clearly, this is he had these bound, and there's several volumes. So I think this one is 3 or 4 volumes. This is Tibetan version. He clearly intended this for publication. It didn't work out. After he died, his sister tried to get these autobiographies published, but this is the rejection letter actually I found in the archives of his sister, which is actually another collection. And it actually says, we're having, due to the Cold War, we are having the same sort of difficulty with many books about China. So they didn't want to actually touch anything that was potentially from that region. So how does this kind of mesh together? So on a technical side, to some extent, the database is already integrated with BDRC, but then hopefully we'll get to a place where it's better cataloged, where the information is more reliable. We want to publish these secular Namtar, which is if you think about it, Namtar, of course, is always this word is only used when we talk about the lives of great masters, and here we have a secular namtar that are, well, not necessarily secular, but by people who are relatively speaking of no religious import. So there is really nothing else like that in the sort of world of Tibetan literature. So the idea is to get these published and accessible to a larger Tibetan reading audience, and of course look at these autobiographical materials. And the great challenge is to sort of see how all these different parts. So we have the artifacts, we have the block prints, the manuscripts, we have the ephemera, these letters and notes and things, how they sort of work, how they work together. And here I am particularly interested in sort of the ritual aspects, the local aspects, and sort of what is not canonical, in the same or in keeping with the spirit of Van Manen himself. So that would contribute to a study of the ritual landscape of the religious and cultural contact zone that is the larger Darjeeling area. And this is how I think it would work to some extent. So this is based on the English version of the autobiography of one of the assistants, Karma Babu, who actually, his full name is Karma Somdum Paul. He initially converted to Christianity. Then kind of his whole family died, and he was like, that's nonsense. I'm going back to my original Buddhist roots. So he writes in his autobiography, on the 4th day of the 6th month of the Tibetan calendar, I asked my Sahib, so Van Manen, for permission to perform a ritual called Chut. Being a Buddhist himself, he, Van Manen, even lent me a large hand drum and a thigh bone from his collection. So then when you look at the texts, then there's actually a number of texts in this collection. And of course, that is not, and also I showed the picture with the drum. So I don't see that as, of course, there's no hard evidence, but I don't see that being an entire coincidence that there were these objects, he had them, his assistants used them, and there were these texts that, and I actually assume that when you go to the Tibetan version of this, it will give you not just Jut, but also the kind of Jut, and maybe even the name of the text that he was using. So there are these texts, these objects, and these autobiographies. We can connect them, not always, but in some cases in this way. So this is Van Manen later in life. And I also thought about where to start with getting an idea of where he started collecting. And I already had sort of an inkling, seeing that his assistants had some connection with what is popularly known as Kum monastery, Yiga Chuling. So in Kum, because they talk about this monastery in their autobiographies, but also they have connections there. And this monastery was founded by a Mongolian Sherab Gyatso, who is here in the middle, who was not a contemporary with Van Manen. I think he passed away in 1890 or something like that. Not sure. But this, both he, and also later on this monastery came to be known as kind of a vital place for people wanting to learn Tibetan, Westerners wanting to learn Tibetan, but also Easterners, Japanese, who were going to Kalimpong, Darjeeling, to this cultural contact zone, to potentially also learn enough Tibetan so they could secretly enter Tibet. So it was also known as sort of like a spy, the monastery that was sort of kind of supportive of potential spies, not always a happy connection with the Tibetan government, you can imagine. Also, Sherab Gyatso himself has this kind of very interesting history in that it seems that he was at some point at Tashilhumbu, he was close to the Panchen Lama, and at some point he was banished and he had to leave. And where do people go when they are banished? To Darjeeling. This is really, I mean, to some extent, it's still going on. If you want to escape the law, then you go to Darjeeling. So it seems that Van Manen also and his assistants had this place as a starting point. this is something that I already had in mind. But when I went through these boxes of papers, I found something really interesting tagged onto the end of another sort of bunch of papers. This is the autobiography of Sherab Gyatso, of this Geshe, the founder of Kuhn Monastery. And I talked to some people, and I have yet to do the field work, and I will go there and, of course, look for this. But this autobiography is nowhere, at least nowhere in BDRC. And I talked to people who are close to this monastery, and they said, we don't know of any autobiography by this master. And it seems that Van Manen had a copy. It's a very interesting autobiography as well. Of course, you want to, I read through it, it's not very long, go through the part where he talks about the reasons for escaping from Tibet or leaving Tibet. And of course, it skips over that part. So it's kind of disappointing in that. But he closes his autobiographies in saying, I've been working a lot, dealing a lot with Westerners, and I've been telling them a lot about the Dharma. And then he says, as one of the last lines, and they haven't managed to convert me yet. And they won't. So anyway, Kuhn Monastery seems to be a key place. And of course, if this is indeed the case, that in Kuhn Monastery itself, and the people there at the moment don't have this autobiography, it would be really great to make it known to them. So I think that's all kind of it, what I want to do, hope to be doing. I think it's going to work. It's sort of course, that's sort of the optimism of not having really started yet, but it sort of feels feels like it will work. So it is a collection that people have really not worked on at all, really. But it has this sort of all these different aspects of text, artifacts, the context, and of course, what we need to do is look at it from different angles, do this multidisciplinary research. And what I think is that it will help also to understand bottom-up processes of religio-cultural production, sort of to look at what is being practiced in what contexts, where, of course, speaking about a time of 100 years ago, but we will do field work and assuming that there is a continuity there. I also assume that, or have the hope that some of the texts that we have in this collection are still, that Van Manen had copied, may be still in the families of a lot of people in these communities right now. So I guess that's all for me. I talked a bit longer than I wanted to. That's it.
We'll have a question and answer round. And for online participants, if you have questions, please type in your questions, or you can click the raise hand icon and then we can call your name. This is on and on, right? If you have questions, yeah.
Thank you, Berthe. I was just curious, in your fieldwork, will you also try to follow up with any living family members of these people with the autobiographies at all?
I would like to. I know that at least 2 of them didn't have any surviving family. So yeah, it's something definitely to consider. I mean, of course, it's 2-3 generations away, so they kind of still live on. Actually, the houseboy, he went on to move to Sikkim and became kind of a well-known figure there. He was one of the first well-known photographers in Kangtok. He really sort of moved up in life, and he lived until I think he passed away in 99. So So there's kind of that heritage, or sort of that what he left, and he had a family there's still family members there. But yes, that's definitely, there's no direct leads, but it will be probably more useful to look at who knew him, who knew them in, you know, a couple of handshakes away. A couple of handshakes away. Yeah.
Thank you.
You mentioned a little bit Van Manen like commissioning different works, and I was wondering if you could talk more about if we know like how many he commissioned, or if that's something that will be discovered, or I guess about that process.
Yeah, so the commissioning, I think the only thing that he really commissioned were the autobiographies. And then what he also had commissioned is sort of have his assistants copy existing manuscripts. So we have a lot sort of booklets that kind of look like this, and they're on you know, recent-ish Indian quality paper in these sort of lined school books. So they look new, but when you look at the contents, then they can contain a lot much older material. So this is something that we definitely need to know. I think he did not really commission anything else other than the autobiographies, of course. With the artworks, my hunch is also that he particularly asked local artists to create works for him. Actually, that is another thing that we want to do with the field work, is also to take very high quality pictures of these works, and to also see at local workshops, do you recognize, you know, of course, there's also generations of Thangka painters and other people involved in handicraft who might be able to recognize the handiwork of certain workshops or families of artists.
Yes, I'm not sure if it's a bit out of context, but thinking about the early discussion on this colonial, not coloniality, and so on, and kind of these decolonizing, whatever word now in science and everywhere. It seems like a very interesting a collection of artifacts and information and these biographies. And in a way, the audience is not only the West, but also the contemporary Tibetans, no? So
And Himalayan people.
Yeah, Himalayan people in general. So I wonder how much maybe in another phase or in this phase you could team up with the local people, no, with Himalayan people to reflect on this, and maybe of course a very long autobiography can only be read by a particular set of people, but I'm sure there are, and there's always a bias in choosing particular extracts, no, as was discussed, but maybe in collaboration with these Himalayans you could extract some particular pieces that could be connecting to the current Himalayans, no, in different formats, as you say, no, like in I don't know, video illustration, as he was trying to do with the Yeti and so on. I wonder if that's part of the project.
Yeah, so one way of doing that would be, of course, field work, making these autobiographies well known, but also, I mean, I am in the fortunate position of being able to hire my own people. And this is kind of not, I guess it's official now, but the PhD student I've just hired is Bhutanese, and the postdoc I just hired is Tibetan, born in India. And of course, not because they are that, but simply because they are the most suitable people. But of course, I also expect that to give a lot more richness, or another perspective on these works that will be really pivotal, I think, for the project. Yes. Yes.
And sorry, and maybe also local Bhutanese artists who could help you convey, the team
Yes.
convey the results. No?
Yeah, so that's also what we will do with the field work. Of course, we cannot take the objects, but we can take, good quality pictures and see some of the things that are just very difficult to know what they are. So even that will be really helpful to work with people on the ground. Yeah, hopefully, and also we will be able to sort of get this kind of perspective on what do you think of these objects just that were meant for use, that are sacred to some, not all of them, of course, just lying around in a basement, and what should we do with them instead? That's a very important discussion to have. It will not be the main sort of topic of the project, but it will definitely be informed by these kinds of discussions. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much for coming and sharing your valuable insights, and all the best wishes for your project.
Thank you.
A small offer, please, can you accept it?
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. Have a good evening.
Thank you for
Good night. Thank
organizing this.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Berthe.